Let me start with the real question people keep asking. Has California already passed a law to tax you per mile every time you drive? Or is this just talk? The honest answer is this: no. You are not being charged per mile yet. There's no statewide law today that sends you a bill for every mile you drive. But what has happened quietly, repeatedly, are laws that expand studies, pilots, and planning around exactly that idea. And that distinction matters because it tells you where this is actually headed. California isn't debating this in public as a brand new tax proposal. It's been framed as research, as a pilot program, as a what-if conversation about the future of transportation funding. The state has already authorized mileage tracking pilots. It has already tested how miles could be counted. It has already studied how drivers might be charged. What it has not done yet is flip the switch and make it mandatory. And that's the part people miss. Governments rarely introduce something like this fully formed. They don't start with, "we're taxing every mile you drive." They start with studies, advisory committees, voluntary programs, language about fairness and infrastructure. And once the framework exists, once the data, pathways, billing concepts, and legal groundwork are in place, the only thing left is a future vote to activate it. Why does California even want this, you might ask? Because the state's road funding has relied on gas taxes for decades, and that model is breaking. Cars are more efficient, electric vehicles don't pay gas tax at all. Revenue is declining while spending commitments stay the same. And when a revenue resource dries up, the question in Sacramento isn't whether spending should shrink. It's what replaces the old system. So this isn't about whether roads need maintenance. Everyone agrees they do. This is about how the state plans to collect money when gas taxes no longer work, and how far it's willing to go to measure price and eventually regulate every movement to do with it. That's what we're actually talking about here. Not a law that passed overnight, but a long, deliberate transition from fuel taxes to pilot programs to a future where driving itself becomes a tracked, billable activity. And once you understand that arc, the per-mile tax stops looking like a rumor and starts looking like a plan that just hasn't been fully turned on yet. To understand why California is even talking about taxing people per mile, you have to start with what quietly stopped working. For decades, road funding relied on gas taxes. You drove, you bought fuel, and the tax blended invisibly into daily life. No tracking, no reporting, no direct measurement of behavior. It wasn't perfect, but it was simple and predictable. That model began breaking the moment cars became more efficient and electric vehicles moved from novelty to policy priority. The state pushed EV adoption aggressively, and in doing so, started hollowing out its own revenue bases. Gas taxes money declined while spending commitments stayed the same. And that created a problem no one in power wanted to say out loud. The funding model failed, but the budget wasn't shrinking with it. Instead of framing this as a spending issue, the language shifted to fairness. EV drivers don't pay gas taxes. Rural drivers travel further. Some people use the roads more than the others. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. And that framing mattered because it gave moral cover to an idea that wouldn't trigger backlash if introduced honestly from the start. So, California don't roll out a tax. It rolled out studies, advisory committees, pilot programs, voluntary participation. Everything was positioned as research, not policy, temporary, not permanent. And because nothing changed immediately, most people turned it out. But those pilots weren't idle. They tested mileage tracking, they tested reporting methods, they tested billing concepts, and they tested public tolerance. Quietly, the state answered its real question: can this be normalized without resistance? That's the pattern. Once governments spend years studying something, they're no longer debating whether it makes sense. They're deciding when it becomes politically viable. And while the state's argument sounds reasonable, roads need funding and gas taxes are declining. It avoids the bigger shift underneath it, moving from taxing fuel to taxing movement itself. And that's how we got here. Not through one big vote, but through gradual normalization. A broken funding model met a government unwilling to reduce its scope. And once you recognize that pattern, what comes next stops being surprising. This isn't theoretical anymore, and it isn't accidental. California has already laid the legal and technical groundwork. Laws like SB 1077 authorized formal study of a road usage charge, and AB 1421 extended that work, kept advisory committees in place, and pushed the state to keep refining a per-mile system. None of these bills imposed a mandatory tax. That line hasn't been crossed yet. But every step moved the system closer to being ready. Officially, the state still calls this research, still pilots, still voluntary. And on paper, that's true. But in practice, the pilots answered the hard question: how miles get reported, how tracking works, how billing would function, and how much resistance shows up when this is rolled out slowly instead of all at once. That's the real purpose of pilots at this scale, not curiosity, but preparation. Here's the key shift that matters. Sacramento has already accepted the idea that miles driven can be treated as a taxable unit. That debate is over inside the legislature. What's left is timing, messaging, and political cover. Once that principle is locked in, everything else becomes a technical problem. And technical problems always get solved. Now, the part people are told not to worry about: data and privacy. A per-mile system cannot exist without verification. Verification means records. Records mean storage, and storage means access. Whether it's GPS tracking, odometer reporting, or third-party managers. The state moves away from anonymous fuel taxes and towards individualized reporting tied to your vehicle. Supporters insist the state doesn't care where you go, only how far. That sounds neat, but it ignores reality. Systems never move towards collecting less data. Every dispute, exception, or enforcement issue becomes justification for more visibility, not less. Here's the blunt truth. Governments do not need to monitor individual movements to maintain roads. Roads were built and maintained long before daily travel was logged and verified. Turning movement into something that must be measured isn't a neutral update. It's an expansion of authority. Legally, one more bill would be needed to make this mandatory. That vote hasn't happened yet. But politically, everything else is done. The studies are finished, the pilots are normalized, the language is polished, and privacy concerns are being managed, not solved. So where this stands now isn't about if, it's about how much people will tolerate, how long quote-unquote voluntary can stay voluntary, and whether anyone notices the line moving before it's already behind them. This isn't about roads anymore. It's about whether Californians accept a system that requires the state to know far more about their daily lives. all to avoid confronting a budget problem directly. This is where the conversation has to get real. Because once you strip away the friendly language, the outcome isn't subtle at all. A per-mile system doesn't just change how money is collected. It changes what the state is allowed to see, track, normalize, and expand. And once that permission is granted, it doesn't get walked back later. If the state is allowed to measure your movement to fund roads, then movement itself becomes a regulated input. Every mile becomes a data point. Every routine becomes measurable. Even if officials insist they don't care where you're going, the system still has to exist to prove how far you went. And the moment that system exists, it stops being just about billing. It becomes a platform. This is the mistake people make when they hear, quote unquote, it's only about miles. Governments don't build one-time tools. They build frameworks. Once mileage tracking is accepted as legitimate, it becomes easy to justify adding layers on top of it. Time of day pricing, location-based charges, congestion penalties, environmental add-ons, temporary surcharges that quietly become permanent. None of that requires new technology. It only requires new rules applied to something that's already running. And here's the truth that needs to be said plainly. By accepting this, people are giving the state permission to experiment on them. Not in theory, in practice. Lawmakers get to see how much monitoring people tolerate, how much inconvenience they'll absorb, and how many quote-unquote temporary measures can stack before anyone pushes back. That's not a conspiracy. That's how policy creep actually happens. Privacy doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes through normalization. First, it's voluntary, then it's incentivized, then it becomes the default. Then opting out gets inconvenient. Then it starts to look suspicious, and eventually it's no longer possible. All the while, people are told nothing fundamental is changing. But something is changing. The assumption that you should be able to move freely without being logged, evaluated, or priced by the state. Once individualized movement data exists, it won't stay neatly boxed. It never does. It shows up in disputes, it becomes relevant in audits, it gets pulled into investigations that have nothing to do with roads. Over time, the question shifts from, are they allowed to do this, to why would they? The moment the infrastructure is accepted, the moral and legal barriers start to fall. There's also a psychological cost that doesn't show up on any spreadsheet. When people know their movement is being tracked, behavior changes. You hesitate, you think twice, you adjust routes, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because being monitored changes how people act. People don't feel freer when movement is tracked. They feel watched. And societies that normalized being watched don't become healthier. They become quieter. And once this level of intrusion is accepted for driving, the justification doesn't stop there. It gets reused. Energy usage, utilities, water consumption, personal vehicles today, personal behavior tomorrow. The argument will always sound reasonable. The impact will always be framed as minimal. And the loss will always be described as necessary. That's how privacy disappears. Not through force, but through precedent. So yes, this should be alarming. Not because of one fee or one bill, but because of what it unlocks next. A state that believes it has the right to log your movement will eventually believe it has the right to manage your behavior. And once that belief is written into law and infrastructure, undoing it becomes almost impossible. This isn't about fear. It's about clarity. The moment people accept that their daily movement must be tracked in order for the government to function, they're no longer debating transportation policy. They're negotiating the boundary between private life and state oversight. And history is very clear about this part. Boundaries only move in one direction unless people notice early and refuse to let them be crossed quietly. Let me leave you with this today. Freedom rarely disappears in one dramatic move. It erodes through systems that sounds reasonable and temporary. This was never just about roads. It's about what the state believes it's entitled to track in order to fund itself. Studies become pilots, pilots become infrastructure, infrastructure becomes policy. And once something is normalized, revising it, it's nearly impossible. The per-mile tax hasn't been imposed yet, that's true, but the groundwork is there. And the real decision is being made now, not later. Whether people notice what's being built before it becomes mandatory, or whether they accept it quietly once it's already in place. Pay attention to what's framed as quote-unquote voluntary. Watch what's justified as quote-unquote fair, and question any system that requires more insight into your daily life to solve a problem the state refuses to confront honestly. Because once movement itself becomes taxable and trackable, the line between public infrastructure and private life doesn't just blur, it moves. And history shows that when that line moves quietly, it rarely moves back. And that's the American backdrop. This show is about clarity, not noise. It's about looking at what's actually happening in this country, not what we're told to believe. And it's about bringing back the values that keep a society strong: responsibility, honesty, and the courage to say what everyone else is whispering. If you found value here, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who thinks differently than you, or someone who's been asking the same quiet questions. Stay sharp, stay aware, and never apologize for using your own judgment in a world that keeps trying to replace it. See you in the next one.